The NIH Stage Model is an intervention development research framework with the ultimate goal of developing maximally potent and implementable interventions defined by their principles. Principles are the reasons for how and why an intervention works. Intervention fidelity means that an intervention is delivered in a way that is consistent with its principles. Let's illustrate using an example from dementia caregiving, which can be challenging and for which care partners often need support. One type of support is to encourage care partners to use respite care, during which they take a break from caregiving. So, let's say we want to design a principle-based respite care intervention. Of course, to deliver this intervention consistent with its hypothesized principles, researchers need to be explicit about what the intervention's hypothesized principles actually are. Some principles, like respect for personal and cultural values, are likely to be universal, meaning that they are necessary for any behavioral or public health intervention to be effective. Other principles may be specific to the targets or goals of a particular intervention. For those intervention-specific principles, it's important to define the principles at a level of specificity that enables them to be rigorously studied. Principles that are too broad are difficult to test and to falsify. So let's apply that idea to our dementia caregiving example. Is it specific enough to say that the intervention's hypothesized principle, the way the intervention works, is by encouraging care partners to make use of respite care? Probably not. For example, for your particular study, what does encouragement mean? What does making use of respite care mean? And how are we defining respite care? If encouragement means assistance finding respite care, how will this assistance be provided? For instance, through emails or visits with case managers. When defining use of respite care, how much respite is sufficient? Frequency and duration. Is it important what the caregiver does during respite? Are any activities prescribed or proscribed? What other factors are essential to effective respite care? For example, do you need to address factors like trust in the alternative caregiver, guilt for stepping away, or fear of missing lucid moments? If these and other considerations are essential to the intervention, then it's likely that these considerations represent key principles on which the intervention is based, and those principles will need to be well specified. Considering what is essential to an intervention is a good way to define the intervention's hypothesized principles. So, intervention fidelity requires explicit hypotheses about an intervention's principles at an optimal level of specificity. Intervention fidelity also requires operationalizing an intervention according to those hypothesized principles. By identifying hypothesized intervention principles and operationalizing according to those principles, we create testable hypotheses about interventions. And by implementing interventions with fidelity to those principles, we improve the confidence and credibility of our study results. That's what makes intervention fidelity important across all stages of the NIH Stage Model, although the specific methods used to achieve and measure intervention fidelity vary depending on the research questions posed at each stage. The specific role of intervention fidelity in each stage of the NIH Stage Model is highlighted in the following chapters. This chapter highlights the role of intervention fidelity in Stage 1 of the NIH Stage Model, which focuses on defining and operationalizing an intervention by its principles. Stage 1 encompasses all activities related to creating a new intervention, or modifying, adapting, or refining an existing intervention, and then testing the intervention for feasibility and acceptability. These activities require clearly defining the hypothesized principles by which the intervention works, as well as developing intervention materials that are necessary to deliver the intervention according to those hypothesized principles. These materials include interventionist training and supervision procedures, operationalizing principles and essential elements, and representing them in intervention materials is key to achieving intervention fidelity. Here's an example. Let's say we need to improve an existing intervention to encourage physical activity among sedentary older adults. Based on empirical evidence and community input, we hypothesize that adding social support will increase the efficacy of the intervention. To develop the intervention materials, we focus on the hypothesized essential elements of the intervention and the principle of social support that we think explains how the intervention affects physical activity. But as we try to operationalize our intervention, we realize we need to be more specific about how social support affects physical activity. Is it by generating a sense of belonging, providing opportunities for group physical activity, offering solutions to challenges that arise when starting an exercise program, instilling a sense of purpose for physical activity? Each of these hypotheses, and many others, reflect alternative intervention principles that could be operationalized in different study interventions or study conditions. Operationalizing these principles and essential elements and representing them in intervention materials is key to achieving intervention fidelity. Principles that are universal across behavioral and public health interventions, like respect for personal and cultural values, should also be specified and incorporated into any intervention under development, and should be included when assessing intervention fidelity. Specifying these universal principles is important to ensure faithful and competent delivery of interventions. Intervention materials are a cornerstone of intervention fidelity procedures. These materials specify what the intervention is, how it should be delivered, how often, for what duration, by whom, in what format, and any other hypothesized essential intervention features. In intervention research, these things should be specified with enough detail that they can be measured systematically. Of course, intervention fidelity materials can be informed by a variety of sources. Ideally, materials will be grounded in relevant research and input from relevant community members, for example, individuals for whom the intervention is intended, interventionists likely to deliver the intervention, community organizations, etc. Interventionist training and supervision procedures follow directly from intervention materials and should be created and refined in Stage 1. Interventionists should be trained and supervised in the hypothesized essential elements of each study intervention, and to deliver it in a way consistent with the hypothesized intervention principles. If there are things that the interventionist should not do, in other words, proscribed elements of the intervention, those things should be included in training and supervision too. These proscriptions may seem especially relevant when a single study compares multiple intervention conditions that are meant to be distinct. Knowing what an intervention is and is not is also relevant when comparing intervention research across studies and across literatures. For studies that plan to harness technology for automated or standardized intervention delivery, the risk of variability in delivery decreases dramatically. However, another aspect of intervention fidelity becomes relevant: confirming receipt or exposure to the intervention. Stage 1 should establish receipt metrics, some of which may be embedded in the intervention technology itself. Although Stage 1 is the venue for making adaptations to an intervention, not all adaptations to an intervention require a return to Stage 1. Adaptations thought to affect an intervention's principles would be considered Stage 1 activities, but adaptations thought to be peripheral to its principles probably don't require a return to Stage 1 research. For instance, if we develop a team-based walking intervention, we may propose that having a team name printed on gear that participants can wear helps to establish a sense of belonging, the principle. Given this hypothesized principle, we wouldn't expect to return to Stage 1 to make adaptations in the sorts of gear provided, like team t-shirts versus hats, or the specific name that the teams choose. After defining the intervention principles and operationalizing interventionist training and supervision procedures, Stage 1 research typically tests the new or adapted intervention for feasibility and acceptability. These outcomes may be descriptive rather than inferential, and testing efficacy may not be relevant. Contemporary guidance strongly discourages use of underpowered clinical trials to estimate effect sizes or to estimate efficacy, because those estimates are inherently unreliable. Stage 1 research need not include tests of intervention effects, but if it does, those tests should be adequately powered for this aim. Intervention fidelity is an important indicator of feasibility. If interventionists cannot be trained to deliver the intervention as intended, the intervention cannot be tested rigorously in subsequent, fully powered studies. During Stage 1, interventionists should be able to demonstrate faithful delivery of the intervention through any of a variety of possible training procedures. At this stage, training may not yet be optimized or efficient, as long as it is successful. Indicators of successful training in Stage 1 may include delivery of the intervention in a small-scale implementation, for example, with a small number of participants or on a truncated time schedule. Pre-specified metrics of acceptable fidelity can serve as indicators of success. With the development and successful feasibility testing of the intervention and interventionist materials in Stage 1, investigators have laid an important piece of the groundwork for larger-scale studies in future stages. This chapter highlights the role of intervention fidelity in Stages 2 and 3 of the NIH Stage Model. Both Stages 2 and 3 are meant to test intervention efficacy, but in different contexts. Contexts where the intervention is delivered by research staff, outside of a real-world community setting, which we call Stage 2. Or contexts where the intervention is delivered by people within community settings, which we call Stage 3. Both Stage 2 and 3 efficacy studies emphasize internal validity, with the expectation of high intervention fidelity, so that study outcomes can be attributed to the intervention itself. Also, Stage 2 and 3 studies test the training and other procedures that are necessary to achieve fidelity, and that were previously developed during Stage 1. Remember that ensuring intervention fidelity means ensuring fidelity to the hypothesized principles of an intervention, not necessarily the exact duplication of every element of an intervention. And an intervention's principles include both the universal principles required for every effective intervention, for example, respect for autonomy and values, and the specific principles that describe how a particular intervention is thought to work. Ensuring high internal validity in efficacy studies usually involves training interventionists to deliver the study interventions as intended, consistent with the hypothesized principles, and then conducting ongoing supervision to ensure intervention fidelity. This emphasis on ensuring that the intervention is delivered as intended is a hallmark of Stage 2 and 3 efficacy studies. In contrast, Stage 4 studies emphasize high external validity, so that fidelity is an important goal, but may be measured rather than ensured. Experts recommend establishing standards for acceptable fidelity so that interventionists can be trained, calibrated, and assessed during ongoing supervision based on the standard. Common methods for assessing fidelity include self-reports by interventionists, reports by participants, and observational coding of recorded intervention sessions. Intervention sessions recorded for the purpose of assessing fidelity may also be a rich source of data for future analysis of intervention processes, as long as participants give consent. Investigators are wise to consider the pros and cons of each method, although observational coding is typically considered the gold standard method. During Stages 2 and 3, fidelity procedures may be resource-intensive and may not be easily integrated into busy clinic or organizational workflows. However, the NIH Stage Model doesn't require such procedures. Rigorous and easily implementable fidelity procedures can certainly be considered if research questions can still be answered. For efficacy studies that harness technology for automated or standardized intervention delivery, the risk of variability in delivery decreases dramatically. However, another aspect of intervention fidelity becomes relevant: confirming receipt of or exposure to the intervention. Investigators are encouraged to establish receipt metrics, some of which may be embedded in the intervention technology itself. Because of their emphasis on internal validity and high intervention fidelity, Stages 2 and 3 studies play powerful roles, both for testing outcomes and for testing hypothesized essential intervention elements and principles. There are a variety of study designs that could be used to test intervention principles during Stages 2 and 3. The NIH Stage Model does not prescribe any specific research design or analytic approach. A few examples from the contemporary literature that could be used to test intervention principles are the multi-phase optimization strategy, or MOST design, just-in-time adaptive intervention design, called JEDI designs, the MEGA study, and the stepped wedge design. A traditional randomized clinical trial also can be a fine approach to testing hypothesized intervention principles. Most importantly, the design should be appropriate for the research questions. To illustrate, let's say we've developed a multi-component intervention to support family caregivers of people living with dementia, and we have hypotheses about how the intervention might work to reduce caregiver burden or stress. The intervention begins with a 10-module, web-based, self-guided educational program about dementia and what caregivers might expect as dementia progresses. If we wanted to test which modules or combination of modules contribute to intervention outcomes, we might choose to use the MOST approach with its factorial design helping to provide efficient statistical power. If we wanted to test a stepped care approach, with some introductory modules for all caregivers and then the addition of other modules only for those caregivers needing additional support, a just-in-time adaptive intervention or JEDI design might be appropriate. Whatever design is used, Fidelity procedures facilitate both clear operationalizations of interventions and distinctions between study interventions. To summarize, Stages 2 and 3 require the clear operationalization of interventions and their hypothesized principles, along with procedures to ensure intervention fidelity. These processes allow for rigorous testing of the intervention and the hypothesized intervention principles. A study in which an intervention is delivered with unknown fidelity means we're not sure what was delivered, and interpreting outcomes becomes impossible. Ensuring intervention fidelity within Stages 2 and 3 can give us confidence in study outcomes before moving on to later stages of research. This chapter highlights the role of intervention fidelity in Stage 4 of the NIH Stage Model. Stage 4 tests intervention effectiveness in community settings with community interventionists. In Stage 4, fidelity to an intervention's principles is meant to give interventionists and delivery systems maximum flexibility in delivering an intervention while still preserving its potency. If an intervention is delivered in a way that is consistent with the principles thought to be responsible for its effects, that is, with fidelity, then those effects are preserved, even with variability in other elements of the intervention. In Stage 4 studies that harness technology for automated or standardized intervention delivery, the risk of variability in delivery decreases dramatically. However, another aspect of intervention fidelity becomes relevant: confirming receipt of or exposure to the intervention. Investigators are encouraged to use reliable measures of intervention receipt and/or exposure, some of which may be embedded in the intervention technology itself. The NIH Stage Model assumes that any necessary work of earlier stages will have been completed before an intervention is tested in a Stage 4 study. Interventionist training and fidelity procedures are typically developed in Stage 1 and finalized and tested in Stages 2 and 3 in preparation for a Stage 4 effectiveness study. Stage 4 is not meant for testing interventions whose efficacy in community settings and the procedures to train community interventionists have not yet been established. Conducting a Stage 4 study of an intervention with unknown efficacy and without demonstrated success in training community interventionists to achieve fidelity makes outcome interpretations difficult. If the intervention doesn't work, is it because the intervention can't be successfully delivered by real-world interventionists? Or because the intervention isn't potent, or for some other reason? Because hypothesized principles form the basis for defining the boundaries of intervention fidelity, the elements on which interventionists have flexibility in intervention delivery can and should be detailed in intervention fidelity materials. For every stage of intervention development, intervention principles include both those universal principles expected of behavioral and public health interventions, for example, respect for values, and specific principles thought to explain how a particular intervention works. Given its focus on external validity, Stage 4 activities related to intervention fidelity may need to shift to tracking or monitoring fidelity rather than strictly ensuring intervention fidelity. This doesn't mean that fidelity to the principles of the intervention aren't important. Measuring is expected in Stage 4, but fidelity procedures are usually required to be more pragmatic in this stage. Intervention fidelity may become one of several implementation outcome measures signaling problems with faithful implementation of the intervention under real-world circumstances, consistent with some models of dissemination and implementation research. If fidelity challenges are documented in aspects of the intervention thought to be related to an intervention's hypothesized principles or essential elements, these documented challenges may signal the need to return to Stage 1 activities. If fidelity challenges are documented with aspects of the intervention thought to be peripheral to an intervention's principles, it may be that a simpler clarification of the intervention and/or training materials would suffice. If the intervention yields acceptable fidelity and effectiveness in a Stage 4 study, a Stage 5 implementation study may be the next logical step. This chapter highlights the role of intervention fidelity in Stage 5 of the NIH Stage Model. Stage 5 tests strategies to support implementation of an intervention in community settings with community interventionists. In the NIH Stage Model, the expectation for Stage 5 is that an intervention has already demonstrated efficacy and effectiveness with sufficient intervention fidelity in earlier stages. This means that we have confidence that the intervention produces desired outcomes when delivered as intended with fidelity. This also means that we've demonstrated that the intervention can be delivered with sufficient fidelity by community interventionists in real-world settings. So, intervention efficacy, effectiveness, and fidelity are defining features of a Stage 5 implementation study. So, if an intervention has already demonstrated that an intervention is effective, and that community interventionists can deliver it with fidelity in real-world settings, why do we need another stage of intervention development? Just because an intervention can be delivered within the health system doesn't mean it will be noticed, appreciated, or utilized. Stage 5 activities address the important step of getting an effective intervention implemented in the community or health system in a sustainable way. Depending on how established an implementation strategy is, a Stage 5 study will vary in where it starts. For novel implementation strategies, Stage 5 will look most like Stage 1. Developing a new implementation strategy, hypothesizing its principles, and operationalizing it by its principles. For well-established implementation strategies with standardized processes and materials, Stage 5 may look more like Stage 4. Intervention fidelity for the implementation strategy will be appropriate for the research design at the relevant stage. A strategy to implement an intervention is itself an intervention, so the development and testing of an implementation strategy mirrors the development and testing of a behavioral intervention in earlier stages. The same sort of thoughtful process is relevant, including identifying the principles of the implementation strategy, operationalizing the strategy by its hypothesized principles, and ensuring that the strategy is delivered or implemented with fidelity. Because Stage 5 studies test implementation strategies to facilitate adoption of an effective intervention in the community organization or health system, most Stage 5 studies involve 2 levels of interventions. It's important to distinguish between these levels: the effective behavioral intervention versus the implementation strategy for that intervention, especially regarding intervention fidelity methods. A typical Stage 5 study asks efficacy or effectiveness questions about implementation strategies. For example, did these strategies facilitate adoption of this effective behavioral intervention? A main indicator of successful adoption is delivery of the behavioral intervention as intended. In other words, intervention fidelity. So, for many Stage 5 studies, fidelity to the behavioral intervention being adopted is the outcome that indicates whether the implementation strategy was successful. This is consistent with some models of implementation research, where fidelity of the intervention being adopted may become an outcome measure signaling problems with faithful implementation of the intervention under real-world circumstances. If Stage 5 activities identify implementation strategies that are effective in supporting adoption of a behavioral intervention, these can be optimized using the NIH Stage Model, just as any other behavioral intervention. In the NIH Stage Model, defining implementation strategies by their principles is equally important to defining other behavioral interventions by their principles. Both activities facilitate the development of maximally potent and implementable interventions that can be delivered flexibly in the settings where they are needed to reach the people who need them.